Russia invades Ukraine. The prelude, build-up, and the dawn of conflict. Introduction. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022 marked one of the most significant geopolitical crises in Europe since World War II. While the conflict may have shocked the world when it erupted, its roots go back several years. This script will explore the background that led to the invasion, the military buildup on the Ukrainian border, and the early hours of the invasion itself, setting the stage for a protracted and brutal conflict. Historical background. To understand why Russia invaded Ukraine, it is crucial to examine the historical and geopolitical context that sowed the seeds of the conflict. Ukraine has long been a battleground of competing interests, particularly between Russia and Western powers. 1. The fall of the Soviet Union and Ukraine's independence. Ukraine, once a part of the Soviet Union, declared independence in 1991 following the USSR's dissolution. Its strategic location and deep cultural, political, and economic ties to Russia made it a vital interest for Moscow. However, Ukraine also harbored aspirations of integrating with the West, particularly with institutions like the European Union, EU, and NATO, which Russia viewed as a direct threat to its sphere of influence. 2. The 2014 revolution and annexation of Crimea. Tensions between Russia and Ukraine flared dramatically in 2014 during Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution. Pro-Western protests erupted against then-President Viktor Yanukovych, who was seen as a puppet of Moscow. Yanukovych fled the country, and a new pro-Western government took charge. In response, Russia annexed Crimea, a peninsula with a majority Russian-speaking population, citing the need to protect ethnic Russians and Russia's strategic Black Sea interests. Following the annexation, pro-Russian separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine declared independence, backed by Russian military and financial support. This led to a brutal war in the Donbass region, which remained unresolved by 2022. Russia's grievances with NATO. Russia's grievances with NATO expansion played a critical role in the invasion. Since the end of the Cold War, several Eastern European countries, once part of the Soviet bloc, joined NATO. Russian President Vladimir Putin repeatedly voiced opposition to Ukraine's potential NATO membership, stating that a NATO-aligned Ukraine on Russia's doorstep was unacceptable. The idea of Ukraine integrating with the West, either through NATO or the EU, was seen by Moscow as a direct challenge to its influence. The military buildup, 2021 to 2022. The invasion of Ukraine did not come out of nowhere. It was preceded by months of military buildup, warnings from intelligence agencies, and diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions. Here's how events unfolded leading up to the invasion. 1. Initial warnings and intelligence. In the early months of 2021, Western intelligence agencies began to notice an unusual accumulation of Russian military forces near Ukraine's borders. Satellite imagery showed large-scale deployments of troops, tanks, artillery, and other heavy equipment, particularly in Russia's western regions and in Crimea. While there had been periodic flare-ups of tension since the 2014 crisis, this buildup was far more significant. In November 2021, U.S. intelligence warned that Russia was planning a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. This prediction was based on several factors: the deployment of over 100,000 Russian troops near the Ukrainian border, increased rhetoric from Moscow, and the movement of logistical support units necessary for a sustained military campaign. Second, diplomatic negotiations and breakdown. In response to the escalating situation, Western leaders engaged in frantic diplomacy to prevent war. High-level talks took place between the U.S., NATO, and Russia, with Ukrainian officials also involved in the discussions. President Joe Biden and European leaders issued stern warnings to Russia, promising severe economic sanctions if an invasion took place. However, these efforts failed to yield any significant breakthroughs. Russia issued security demands, including a legal guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO and that NATO would pull back its forces from Eastern Europe, demands the West could not accept. Meanwhile, Russian officials continued to deny any intent to invade Ukraine, calling the military buildup a routine exercise. The final buildup. By January 2022, Russia had amassed over 150,000 troops along the Ukrainian border, including units from the Russian Far East, signifying the gravity of the situation. Additional forces were stationed in Belarus, a close Russian ally, positioning them within striking distance of Kyiv, Ukraine's capital. As the situation deteriorated, the U.S. and its allies began evacuating embassies in Kyiv and advising their citizens to leave Ukraine. Despite mounting evidence of an impending invasion, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and many Ukrainians remained skeptical that Russia would launch a full-scale attack, given the enormous risks involved. Yet, the West continued to warn that the invasion was imminent. The early hours of the invasion. February 24, 2022, the war begins. In the early hours of February 24, 2022, after months of speculation, diplomacy, and military posturing, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation in Ukraine. In a televised address, Putin claimed the operation was aimed at demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine, framing it as a defense of ethnic Russians and an effort to prevent NATO encroachment. He warned other nations against interference, stating that any intervention would lead to consequences they have never seen. Shortly after the announcement, Russian missiles and airstrikes hit targets across Ukraine, including military installations, airports, and critical infrastructure in cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. The initial strikes aimed to cripple Ukraine's air defenses, command structures, and logistics to pave the way for a ground invasion. The first wave of ground assaults. Simultaneously, Russian ground forces launched a multi-pronged invasion, advancing from Belarus in the north toward Kyiv, from the east toward Kharkiv, and from Crimea in the south. The scale and speed of the assault caught many by surprise, despite the months-long buildup. In the north, Russian forces advanced swiftly toward Kyiv, hoping for a quick decapitation of the Ukrainian government. In the east, they pushed toward Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, while troops from Crimea made rapid advances in the south, aiming to seize key coastal cities and secure a land bridge to Crimea. Third, Ukrainian resistance. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Ukrainian forces mounted a determined defense. President Zelensky declared martial law and ordered general mobilization, urging citizens to take up arms in defense of the nation. Ordinary Ukrainians, from teachers to business people, joined the resistance, while the military, bolstered by years of training and equipment from the West, proved more formidable than many had expected. In Kyiv, the situation grew tense as Russian forces closed in on the capital. Ukrainian troops, backed by volunteer fighters, set up defensive positions throughout the city, preparing for an expected Russian assault. In Kharkiv and other cities, intense fighting broke out as Ukrainian forces attempted to repel Russian advances. International response. The invasion immediately triggered a global outcry. Western nations condemned Russia's actions, with the United States, the European Union, and their allies announcing unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions targeted major Russian banks, oligarchs close to Putin, and key sectors like energy and defense. Additionally, military aid began flowing into Ukraine from the West, including weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The international community also witnessed a refugee crisis unfold, as tens of thousands of Ukrainians fled their homes, seeking safety in neighboring countries like Poland, Romania, and Hungary. The world watched in horror as scenes of devastation and human suffering began to emerge from Ukrainian cities under attack. Conclusion. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia was the culmination of years of geopolitical tension, military posturing, and failed diplomatic efforts. While Russia's grievances with NATO and Ukraine's Western aspirations played a significant role in the lead-up to the conflict, the speed and scale of the invasion shocked the international community. The early hours of the invasion set the stage for a brutal and protracted conflict that would reshape not only the future of Ukraine, but also the global order. As Ukrainian forces mounted a fierce resistance and the West imposed severe economic sanctions on Russia, it became clear that the conflict would not be a quick or easy victory for Moscow. Instead, it would mark the beginning of a long and bloody war with profound consequences